This is going to be a little bit of a different video because every once in a while I'll have people ask me, how can you tell the age of tap handles? What's a modern tap handle? What's a vintage tap handle? And I just had one of my followers ask me that same kind of question. So, what makes a vintage tap handle? And what is the difference between them? So I'm not going to go into it in a ton of depth in this video, but I'll do a kind of series of videos covering a few different things about vintage tap handles or the age of tap handles. And I've got a couple of different tap handle examples in front of me so we can cover some of the details. First of all, as far as what makes a vintage tap handle or what makes something vintage, there's a number of different definitions. The definition that I typically go by is something that's over 30 years old. So other people might say a little bit shorter, might say 25 years or older. Other people might say a little bit older as the starting amount of time, but typically vintage, you're going to say about 30 years or older. And then you also have some other different terms that people will throw out. So they'll sometimes say antique or other things like that. With tap handles, I typically don't refer to a lot of them as antique because with antique, you're typically talking about significantly older ages. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Some of the older, like metal ball tap handles, might be falling more into the category of antique, but because they'd still be vintage because they're older than that period of time, they fall nicely into that category. I tend not to break them apart. As far as telling whether or not something is a modern tap handle or a vintage tap handle, some of it is by the materials, the production, and the design. You can sometimes spot based upon those, and those will be kind of general items. So that means that if it's got a design that isn't common anymore, or if they use a production that isn't common anymore, then that oftentimes will mean that it's a vintage tap handle. Also, you can oftentimes tell by the beer or the brand or the logos to tell whether or not something is a modern version or a vintage one. Sometimes there will be items that are produced to look like an old one, but that is relatively uncommon unless it's specifically as a prop item or something similar. Here we've got a couple of different tap handles to give a few examples. So these ones are ones that are vintage. So the Amstel, the Coors Light, and the Sam Adams. All of these are ones that you'd be able to safely place their date of production or usage in the kind of like the 90s or earlier. So that means that at the very earliest, I wouldn't expect any of those to be produced before like the mid 90s. Most likely they'd be, or after the mid 90s, most likely they would have been produced before that. So with the Amstel one, this is a little bit of a hard one to place because you just have to say based upon production or if you got one out of the box. But that's a design that would have been more common in the uh, maybe sometimes in the 90s, but more likely in the like 70s or 80s. That's what I've seen. If people do have exact dates for any of these, definitely let me know in the comments. With the Coors Light, that's kind of an 80s design. That's also something that the design, the color, the all of that sort of stuff is stuff that was very common in the 80s and early 90s. So that gives you a safe way of kind of placing it around that. With the Sam Adams one, with the Sam Adams one in the bars, you would have been seeing in the, kind of like the mid 90s, you would have been seeing the more rounded one. So this would have been something that more likely would have been produced around the 80s. And that's based upon the production. The design is also well as what I've seen. And then the Delirium is one that I wanted to point out because now you're getting into the more modern ones, but sometimes you're going to be getting into designs that would be carried over for a long period of time. So that means that the design might have been a design that they would have been using for maybe 20 or 30 years, sometimes even longer. but it's still one that's actively being produced. This design and this style, Delirium is consistent with that. And so that means that if you're seeing this design, then it's safe to say, or then that means that it could be a newer one, or it could be a little bit older. And then with Syntax, with Mother Earth Brewing, this is a style that you're going to see for some of the more modern ones. And also, there's a couple of things on this that will give you a placing of it being a more modern production. So, first of all, you've got a more detailed kind of like wraparound sticker or design there. That's something that's a little bit more common in the modern ones. Also, you'll notice that some of the elements or the fixture pieces are a little bit more common and that or a little bit more modern. And then sometimes you can also tell by any of the elements the amount of wear. So that Syntax is one of those ones that's a little bit more modern. Anything that designs like that are ones that you would have been seeing more very end of the 90s and throughout the aughts and teens. So this also is the type of design where if you saw it on a tap right now, it could be a brand new tap. So hopefully that's a little bit of good starter information. I will try and do more in kind of like a series of stuff to cover more details for folks.